Part 1. Reenacting the French Napoleonic Fusilier. This video is primarily aimed at the detail-oriented living historian or reenactor. I will be focusing on the French Napoleonic Fusilier infantry impression of June 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. This is the accumulation of 5 years of research by my friend Ian McWherter. This impression would not have been possible without his diligence, knowledge, and guidance. With that said, every effort has been made to replicate off the surviving original artifacts, including construction techniques and authentic materials. Where an original no longer exists, cultural and material research along with the use of the Bardin 1812 Army regulations was utilized to make sure the finished product was as museum accurate as possible. This is part 1 for headgear and uniforms. Please check out part 2 for gear and weaponry soon. So with that, let's begin. So let's go ahead and start off from the top of the soldier and work our way down. The first thing we're going to look at is essentially the off-duty cap, the pokelem, which was again specified in the Bardin regulations of 1812. Quite an interesting cap, and let me go ahead and show you my reproduction now. The pokelem is manufactured from a dark navy blue broadcloth with red wool piping, as you can see here. Let's see, I went ahead and used a button mold covered in black linen in order to keep the sides up. The front is sewn down as well. The 21 on the front, I didn't follow the pattern piece. The pattern I actually got off of eBay. I went ahead and followed the font that was directly off of the uniform buttons, which made a whole lot more sense considering the one in the pattern looked very funky to me. On the inside, likewise followed the pattern, but also direct reflection of the original, and it's just basic linen with a drawstring. The whole cap is designed so it actually has these ears that will fit into the inside, and they button up, and it can be undone so that in the event of inclement weather, the soldier can pull that down and provide himself with a little more warmth. The French Army introduced the Shako to replace the tricorn style hat, if you will, in 1806. So by the time the Battle of Waterloo came about, this was the last variation. So I searched high and low in order to try and find the most accurate Shako I could possibly get my hands on. The reproduction that I decided to go with was from Sergei Antiques in Finland. As you can see, it's got everything 100% correct. Brass fittings, it's felt, it's leather, the inside is made of linen, it has the buckle adjustment in the back for head size. The only thing that is wrong with it right now is that it doesn't have the proper pom-pom for the 1812 regulations. With the Shako cover, there are 2 surviving originals, and I was able to find pictures of one of them in the French First Empire Museum. Both of the surviving examples are a black oilcloth, completely sewn by hand, so I opted to replicate that as closely as I possibly could. I used the Shako itself in order to derive a pattern. As you can see, it's made of a oilcloth that from my own recipe. It's linen with silk ties, and just like with the originals, I made sure that it ties on the right-hand side. It should not tie on the left. It should be on the right-hand side to match the originals. By far the most challenging thing about this entire impression was the Model 1812 Habit Vest. I was not happy with the commercially available pattern that I found. It was just way too modern. What I specifically was looking for was something that matched the originals. As you can see here, it is very, very shallow, as in it's very short. It ends at the navel. Another thing that is of note is on the lapels themselves, you can note on the originals they're very sharp points up at the top. You can also see that the arms are very narrow. They're almost like tubes, and that means that the arm sickles likewise are going to be very tight. So what I was forced to do eventually was to actually purchase this pattern. It's actually for an American militia coat. So I started with this and cut it and pasted, and boy, I went through about 4 or 5 different variations until I got something that I was actually comfortable with before actually cutting the real wool and working on the actual habit. So this was the end result of all of my efforts. As you can see, it's pretty much a dead ringer for the original in the French Army Museum in Paris. We'll zoom in a little bit here, specifically on the lapels. We'll start there. And you can see how I was able to get those very sharp points, which pretty much all reproductions lack, and they just round off those corners, which is 100% wrong. The arms are nice and tight. They're very much almost like tubes. From a modern perspective, they're almost too tight and uncomfortable, oddly enough. And here you can see some of the details that I put in for the cuffs. The buttons all came from Sergei Antiques in Finland, so I actually ordered all the buttons for the habit vest and the Galette, along with the Shako. Here's a nice view of the back, specifically showing all of the detail that had to go into this. Obviously a very time-consuming project. Here's a nice view of the detail of the back tails. The red piping, what appears to be piping, is actually rolled up red scarlet wool. And it's the idea that there should be a pocket there, but it's obviously false, and that's just sewn and tacked down directly in. Another interesting thing to note here are the ends and the crowns, obviously for the emperor himself, Napoleon. Originally, the way these were done is that they were a metal stamp in which you could put it over the fabric, stamp it out, and therefore all the crowns, all the ends would be completely 100% uniform. I, however, didn't obviously have that, so I had to hand cut these out individually and sew each and every single one in by hand. For the inside lining, you can see how the main body is primarily linen. However, the collar and the tails are done with what is called a caddis wool material. There's also 2 pockets put into the tails of the coat, again replicating off of the original. And the regulations called for 16 hook and eyes, including the 3 on the collar. Now moving on to the trousers, you've got the dress pantaloons, and then of course you've got the campaign coveralls as well. The problem that most reproductions get wrong is that they're way too low. If we look at original diagrams and engravings and such, we can see that the trousers fit exceptionally high. We're talking about reaching at chest level. In fact, if you look at the ones I'm wearing here, likewise, they're very high. Now, pictured here is an original pair, actually, that was manufactured in 1817, but it does conform to the regulations of 1812. So I decided to utilize this in regards to my reproductions. The originals are made of a tricot, which is a wool serge. And also the linings are constructed of a gray linen. The buttons are fabric-covered wooden molds. My reproductions started off actually from a pattern from Connect's Corner. I had to modify it from a small fall to a broad fall trouser, and then added, gosh, probably another 8 some inches up in the height in order to get it to work. The material I got from Najeki. It's actually a milled serge, what the French called a tricot material, and was able to go ahead and replicate the pattern just off of looking at pictures of the original. Even all the way down to the tapering of the legs so that the gaiters will fit in nice and perfectly. Moving on into the interiors, you can see how I likewise duplicated the gray linen on the barriers and on the broad falls. And broad falls, what I mean by that, by the way, is from basically side seam to side seam. The waistband is very high, and the buttons, once again, are the fabric-covered button molds made of wood. There's only one pocket in the entire thing, and that is the watch pocket up on the waistband. In fact, if we go ahead and we close this up, you can also take a note now of just how high-waisted that these pants really are. And again, that's because of the galette and also the habit vest being so short, and therefore you cover up all of those lines. You shouldn't be able to see any buttons when the coat is being worn. So let's move on to what, from a modern perspective, we would call the fatigue uniform. It consists of the galette, which is the short jacket, and a pair of linen or hemp trousers. With this original example here, you can see that the galette is a very short jacket. It is designed to take the beating so that the habit vest could be utilized for the parades and for battles and things like that. Each galette was specific to the regiment in regards to the actual color facings that were placed upon it. This is my reproduction of the galette, As you can see, it's got the blue facings, which is matches up with the 21st Regiment. For the patterning, I essentially used the same one that I had developed for the habit vest, but went ahead and obviously modified to make it shorter, eliminating the tails. I added the shoulder boards onto it, as you can see here, which again is by regulation. A couple interesting things to take note of here is, one, this is a functional pocket on the right side, but the one on the left is completely fake, the purpose of which is to obviously just have symmetry involved here. Now, if we go ahead and look at the inside, you can also take a look at the linen lining. I tried to also duplicate a very common technique utilized at the beginning of the 19th century, which is all of these plackets of wool. The idea being is that when the item would wear, you could easily replace the wool on the edges and therefore extend the life of the garment. We'll flip this over real quick here. Now, if we look at the last little interesting thing here on the back, there is a little wooden button mold covered in linen, and that's so the cartridge box can latch onto it. So if you bend over, the box isn't going to slide down on your right-hand side. Along with the galette, while on campaign, the individual French soldier wore these. These are your campaign overalls. They're made of a hemp canvas, and as you can see, they're pretty much the exact same pattern as the Knick's corner that I modified for the pantaloons. The suspenders are on here. You got one set and would switch them back and forth. These are made out of a hemp webbing with linen ends. And as we could see, the major difference here, besides the material, is that you do have some extra pockets here. This wasn't considered a dress uniform, so soldiers could put extra things in the pockets that are provided here. We'll go ahead and we'll zoom out a little bit here as well. And you can see these don't taper in at the ankles, allowing for more freedom of movement and comfort. So let's move on to the Gaiters. Picture here is an original set recovered off the battlefield of Borodino in 1812. They do conform to the regulations of 1812, primarily because they do come up to just below the knee. I decided to go off of these originals for my reproductions because, well, there's just not that many of these things that survive anymore. So these are the wool parade gaiters that you see here. So I decided to also use a derivative of this when I made my linen gaiters for the campaign dress. In order to even get started, I needed something I could at least start with. So I went ahead and decided to purchase this Knick's corner pattern and went ahead and modified from there. And it was quite a challenge, to be perfectly honest, but it was a lot better than what was commercially available that advertised as Napoleonic, because the problem with those is that the seam was on the side, and it's quite obvious by the original that the seam is in the back, which makes sense, so therefore you can adjust it as necessary as you're bringing it in for a tighter fit around the calf. So here are my regulation set of gaiters. At the bottom here are the black wool parade slash battle. Plain black wool with brass coin buttons. Matches up with the originals recovered off Borodino almost perfectly. And then right above this, I've got the campaign gaiters. They're made of a canvas linen. The buttons likewise are wood covered in the same material. And these are what would have been worn mostly on the march. Moving on to the issued Greatcoat. Interesting backstory on this, in that there was really no official Greatcoat in the regulations until 1812. Now, part of the problem is that the regulations of 1812 specify a beige Greatcoat. But let's face it, the beige in the old French language means the color of naturally blended wool. It did not come to mean tan in color until about 1855 or so, where you start seeing it in the English lexicon, and even at that, it doesn't become popular until the 1880s. There are sheep with natural brownish fleece, but, well, black and white fleece was far more common during this time period, and therefore the greatcoat should be gray. That's why most of the surviving officer capotes are gray. That's why Napoleon's famous capote is gray, and that's why I decided to go with gray. My reproduction is based entirely on the barred-in regulations of 1812 in regards to the enlisted man's greatcoat. As you can see, it's got a 10-button front, 5 on each side. Each of the buttons is actually a wooden button mold that's covered. And as you can see, there's the collar with a single hook and eye closure. And if we go ahead and zoom down towards the bottom, there's also some buttons there. So it could actually be folded back to the individual's rear, and therefore keeps the tails from getting in the way. And in fact, if we flip this over here, you can see how the waist adjustment in the back, there we go, matches perfectly with what the original drawing specifications were. There are two access points to allow the individual to get into the pockets of the habit in the tails. The lining is just a heavy canvas linen, along with an inside left breast pocket. That was likewise sort of a best guess based upon the fact that the model of 1828, 1845 all had a pocket in the same location. So to me, it just made total sense to try and replicate that as best as I could. The coat is also designed so it could be buttoned to the left and buttoned to the right. Purpose of this was the French believed that the buttonholes would have to wear evenly. So that's why in some of the original engravings and such you see, again, greatcoats buttoned on the left and some buttoned on the right. Here's a great example of an original shirt of the era made of a lightweight linen. Every French soldier was actually issued 3 of these and was was part of the linen allowance, if you will. So the idea was you would have 2 always stowed away in the haversack, which, let's face it, if you're making 3 shirts entirely hand sewn, it proved to be quite a laborious task. The pattern I went with was likewise a Connects corner. It pretty much was a dead ringer to the original, so it was super easy. In fact, to be perfectly honest, this was the few patterns that I could purchase and didn't have to modify. I just bought it, cut, sewed, good. So here's one of the shirts that I manufactured. We'll look at the collar first. It may appear that it's a little too high. In fact, it looks kind of odd, but when you consider that the individual soldier was issued a neck stock and was required to wear it, it makes total sense. Moving down towards the arm, you can see the period reinforcement, because obviously where the arm reaches the body, that's going to be a major stress point. And that's the soldier's number, date of manufacture, and that's essentially the shirt. Now, French soldiers were issued underdrawers, roughly about 2 a year, oddly enough as that sounds. And I came across a lot of various different patterns and such, and I just decided to go with one that was very basic. In fact, I found it was a past patterns that you see here. So just decided to go with that as it was representative of early 19th century. It was actually a great pattern to work with. It was very simple. As you can see, it's got the very wide waistband. I just went ahead and used some regular 2-hole bone buttons. It's got the waist adjustment in the back with a whole lot of pleating. Again, very common for early 19th century with a waist adjustment in the back. I'll move this around here so we can see this just a little bit better. So it's a very full seat, which allows you a lot of good movement, and again ties up at the not at the ankles, but just below the knee, which again, you don't want them getting in the way of the gaiters because that would affect the fit and things of that nature. Now, the neck stock of the late Napoleonic era was a bit of a mystery. I found quite a few patterns online, none of which that I really liked. And luckily enough, I came across this picture of an original in the First Empire Museum in France. So I wanted to duplicate that, and the biggest challenge I had, oddly enough, initially was trying to find the right buckle. And oddly enough, by digging around on eBay, I found a Civil War relic with a 3-prong buckle, which worked perfectly. So I bought it and repurposed it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the reproduction then. This proved to be a little bit of a challenge because I didn't have a pattern, but I was able to proportion it knowing about the size of the buckle and obviously the size of my own neck, and was able to kind of maneuver it out from there. You can see it's got a little pocket in there, so the tab actually goes on the inside and therefore you won't see it. And if I say so myself, I think I did a pretty good job at nailing it from just looking at the picture. Moving on to the footwear, every Napoleonic era soldier was issued with 2 pairs, all of them made on a straight last, and according to French Army regulations, should be hobnailed out as you see here. My reproductions came from Umlauf shoes in Czechoslovakia. As you can see, they're dead ringers for the original diagram just shown. On straight last, wooden pegged, hobnailed out exactly as they should be. I'm just in the process of breaking them in, and they fit like sneakers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for the uniforms and headgear of the French Napoleonic soldier of 1815. Please tune into my next video, which will cover all of the gear and the weaponry.